much. My name is Paul Golan. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. We're hosting this ongoing Secular Talmud course, and we're very happy to have Max Buchdahl as our instructor, teacher, guide. And I will turn it back over to him in a moment, but I just wanted to say a few words. First of all, of welcome. If this is your first time, we've opened up this session as an orientation to explain how the class works and why we're doing it. Some of you I recognize have been participating for a while, so thank you for that. I want to extend a special thank you, first of all, to our anonymous donors for supporting this program. They care very deeply about humanistic Judaism and its various expressions and recognize that Talmud study is relevant to secular Jews, secular and humanistic Jews. And that is something that I don't think is known out in the world. I think there's a presumption about secular Jews as having kind of walked away from Jewish learning. And I know personally that that's not true. And we know that as a movement of humanistic Judaism, how many of us are really deeply engaged by the Jewish tradition of learning. And that as we get into it and deepen our understanding of it, we recognize that our history and our history of ethics is very human. It is the story of our people. So that's one of the reasons why, but I think there are many reasons why folks may be involved, which I hope you will learn as you go through this orientation and hopefully continue on with the class. The anonymous donors support us because they recognize that there are expenses involved in these kind of programs, and we like to compensate people who do work. I think it's kind of a good value for us to have. And as you may already know, this is a project that we've made available to our members. So by being a member of either the Society for Humanistic Judaism directly or one of our local affiliated communities, we have about 30 in cities in the US and Canada, you are supporting this movement, and we very much thank you for that and appreciate that. If you're not yet a member, you're welcome to take a couple of classes with us, but then we do ask you to show your support for our movement by becoming a member. Most of what we do is free and available to anybody. We really don't want to have up these kind of paywalls for members only. We do want to at the same time show our appreciation for membership, but we want to put this out in the universe, and your membership and your support philanthropically allow us to try to reach many more people who, as many of you may know, are secular and not yet humanistic Jews. They don't know that this is an option for them as an expression of Jewish identity, and many of them are not involved in any kind of organized Judaism. And this is one way that we try to help people recognize that they can be involved, they can learn Jewishly, they can engage with our rich tradition and history, and still remain authentic to who they are and what they believe. And that is really our mission at the Society for Humanistic Judaism. So again, thank you all for being here and for your support. Please invite more people if you know them and if they might be interested to participate. But I look forward to this class today and hearing from Max, and I'll turn it back over to you. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. Just one brief note, you might see that we're recording the session. Generally speaking, we don't record our classes. We want this to feel intimate. We don't want people to feel like what they're saying is going to, be out there in the world. But we're making this exception for the orientation, just to allow folks who might want to join the class at a later point to have this introduction available to them. Yes, folks should continue. I mentioned it a few minutes ago. Folks should continue to put in the chat where they're calling in from. We've got many time zones covered already, yeah, feel free to go ahead. Okay, my name is Max Buchdahl. Really nice to meet you all. Really nice to see familiar faces from the class, new faces as well. I've been teaching, so this class has been going on since I think last July, a little over a year now. I've been teaching it since December, so coming up on a year. And we just back in August finished a chapter, which is a really, really amazing and momentous thing. It's a lot of material to cover. And we're really excited to do this orientation, especially now that the sort of high holiday season is behind us, to now do this orientation session and then begin a new chapter. We'll look at the beginning of the chapter a little bit tonight, and then really in earnest, we'll start next week. I'll say a couple of words about myself. I notice if I say that you should put your location, everything, I should probably say it about myself. So I am studying to be a rabbi. People have said Rabbi Max many times in emails, and it's very nice and very kind. But I don't yet have that title. I'm still a student. I live in Washington Heights in Upper Manhattan in New York City. I'm originally from Baltimore. I saw a couple of Maryland folks in the chat. So I'm originally from Baltimore. I was gonna, for a long time, whatever, it's a long story. I was gonna be a sports journalist. My life took a different path, and I finished a master's in Talmud at the Jewish Theological Seminary here in New York last year, and have been doing teaching for all different kinds of people, all different kinds of topics, and I really look forward every week to this Tuesday night class. It's an amazing opportunity to think about the Talmud in a new way, to introduce people to material that they sometimes are familiar with and not familiar with, feel like they have some grasp of, but not totally. And so I think we have a lot of fun. There are several folks here, both on camera. Thank you, Beverly, for the nod. On camera and not on camera. And so we have a lot of fun, and I hope those people who've been in the class for a while can, will continue to affirm that. And we're excited to have some new people. So tonight is going to look a little bit different than a normal class. Let me talk a little bit about what we're going to do tonight. Tonight, we're going to mostly do an overview of sort of rabbinic history to set up a background for learning the Talmud. One of the hard things about learning the Talmud, especially as a beginner, is that the language of the Talmud and the concepts that it uses and the way that it's presented often assumes that the person reading it has a lot of knowledge. Part of this is that the Talmud was not really written is really the wrong word, but was not really created as a text for the masses. It was mostly created as a text for scholarly elites, and it's only in the last 100 years or so that there's been a real revolution in Talmud study that has opened it up to the masses in a really amazing way. But part of what's hard about that is that there's so much background and so much context that often isn't there. So what I want to try and do tonight is provide some of that background and some of that context. What I'll say here first is that there are going to be some times, probably over the course of this orientation and the class, once we really get started in earnest next week, where you will see some sort of normative claim, some sort of theological claim about the Talmud as law. And the reason that I present those sometimes is not because it necessarily has a normative claim, but because it's important in terms of understanding where the rabbis are coming from, and understanding the text of the Talmud often means engaging with certain theological claims that we may not hold. So I just wanted to sort of say that out at the front. Okay, I think that's about it for right now. Over the course of the class, if you have questions that come up, I'm gonna try to pause. So we're gonna run through a slideshow. The slideshow will be available to you after the class. I assume we will not get through the entire slideshow. So both, if there are things that I say in passing that you want to go back to or follow up about, you'll have access to the slides, both in terms of those things which we do cover and the things that we may not cover in the next hour and 20 minutes or so. One other thing about the way the class works, we run from 7:30 to 9 Eastern. We take a 5-minute break, usually sometime around the halfway mark, depending on where we land. So that's a good thing to sort of know and plan for. If you have questions that come up over the course of this orientation, you can either put them in the chat, and I'll do my best to pause every few slides and engage with some of those questions, or you can use the raise hand function on Zoom, and similarly, I'll try and get to you when I get to a good stopping point. Okay, so the first half was going to take up most of our session tonight is that background, sort of setting the stage for who are the rabbis, what is the world they're coming from, what is the material that they produce, because the Talmud is not the only rabbinic text out there. There are a lot of other texts that you should know about. And then after we finish that part, the sort of orientation piece, we're going to move to begin looking at the chapter that we're going to be starting next week. Okay, so we'll look at a little bit just to give you a taste, just to familiarize yourself with some concepts and some of the language that's used in this chapter. And then next week we'll really get down to business. Okay, all right. So I'm gonna share my screen here. Also, you should know, because I'm sharing my screen, I won't be able to see everyone at once. Also, because there are a lot of you, but I'll do my best to sort of pay attention to if folks are raising their hands. Okay, great. All right. So I just if I'm looking over here, I have a monitor, so that's where I'm looking if I'm reading slides. Okay. In Rabbinic Judaism, this is sort of this next slide will be really the sort of mythic history of Rabbinic Judaism that's important to understand in terms of how the rabbis conceive of themselves and how they see themselves as connected to what came before them. So according to Rabbinic Judaism, this might be something that you're familiar with. When, according to Rabbinic Judaism, when Moses and the Jewish people stood at Mount Sinai, there were two different Torahs given to Moses. Okay, Torah number 1 is the written Torah. That's a reference to the 5 books of Moses that we have. And then also there was an oral Torah that was passed down orally and was never written down. The oral Torah often included traditions that were meant to help you understand the written Torah. There was also a large taboo for much of rabbinic history, until it just became too much, taboo against writing down the oral Torah. Right? Obviously, oral Torah means that it's not going to be written down, but there was also a lot of discomfort with writing it down, in particular because of a fear that if the oral Torah were to be written down, it could be abused or misused by other groups, right? That because if it's an oral tradition, you have more control over how it gets passed down, to whom it gets passed down, all of those kinds of things. Once it's written down, it's fair game for anyone to try and use. So eventually, the oral Torah became so large and expansive that there was no way to keep it memorized in people's minds and mouths. And so eventually the oral Torah, which here refers to mostly traditions sort of appended to the written Torah, and includes much of what we're about to see, eventually components of the oral Torah were written down. What's hard here is that there could be, and probably was, a lot that was not written down and that was forgotten. Right? It's hard to make those types of arguments from silence, but it seems inevitable just based on the sort of breadth of Rabbinic Judaism that there wouldn't be traditions that were, that didn't make it out of this era. Okay. What we're going to do tonight is look at the different components of the Oral Torah, okay, because the Oral Torah, I mentioned this a minute ago, is expansive, right? It includes the Talmud in some ways, but also includes a lot of other texts. So we're going to look at those texts over the course of tonight. Okay, it's helpful to think about three different rabbinic eras, three different fairly discrete eras. Okay, there is, you can sort of, finagle a little bit around the edges here with dates and layers and things like that. But for the most part, I think the easiest way is to think of these three eras. The first era begins at the beginning of the 1st century CE and lasts until the year 220. Okay, this is called the Tannaitic era. Okay, Tana means to repeat, literally, or to teach. All right, the rabbis from this era are called Tanaim. And during the Tannaitic era, it is all in the land of Israel. Everything is happening in the land of Israel, eventually becomes Roman Palestine. But everything is happening in the land of Israel. Obviously, I should say there are certainly Jewish communities who live outside the land of Israel during the Tannaitic period. That is for sure true. There's a very, very large community in Egypt, for instance. There's definitely already a community in Babylonia. But in terms of the material produced by the rabbis in this era, we're talking about basically exclusively the land of Israel. Okay. Here are a couple of names of Tanaim who you might recognize or not recognize. Obviously, the biggest, perhaps, well, I don't know, perhaps the biggest event during this era is the destruction of the temple, okay, in the year 70 by the Romans. There's sort of a lot that can be said about what happens when the temple is destroyed, how it changes Rabbinic Judaism, and all of that. But there does continue to be Jewish presence in the land of Israel after the destruction. There's also another big event is the Bar Kokhba revolt. I didn't put this here, but the Bar Kokhba revolt, which happens around the year 130, is really a traumatic event in which a group of rebels tries to basically regain Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. It goes very, 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 very badly, and whole Jewish communities are wiped out, and that's also a sort of formative moment during this time period. In the year 220, we'll see this again in a moment. There is a rabbi named Rav. You can see here on my list of prominent Amoraim. There's an Amora called Rav who begins his life in the land of Israel and eventually moves to Babylonia. And when he moves to Babylonia, he takes with him a lot of land of Israel material, I'll just say. Okay. And that's when, in earnest, a major rabbinic movement begins in Babylonia. So this second era is called the Amoraic era. Okay, lasts, as I said, from 220 until about the year 500. Now we are split between the land of Israel and Babylonia. Okay, two centers now. And here are some names of very famous Amoraim. There's a lot of differences in terms of how Tanaim and Amoraim present law, talk to one another, analyze data. We'll see all these things as we move along. This later era, the Savaraic era, I'm not going to say so much about it. We don't really know very much about it, in part because most of the rabbis of this time are anonymous, and this is the era in which the Talmud really gets sort of added and glossed and really turns into the document, the Talmud that we now know of. Okay, and by that point, already actually by about the end of the 4th century, there is now virtually no Jewish community left in the land of Israel. There are some, but it's very, very small. And at that point, Babylonia becomes really takes over as really the center of Rabbinic Judaism. Okay, so these are just three. I'll refer back to these three eras a lot over the course of tonight and over the course of the class in general. Just good to think about. We have three different time periods here. The Tanaim are the earliest, all in the land of Israel. Most talk almost exclusively in Hebrew. Amoraim talk in a mix of Hebrew and Babylonian Aramaic. Okay, and the Savoraim, by the last period, it's basically exclusively Aramaic. Okay, I'll continue to repeat these things. It'll show up a lot as we move along. Just see if there's anything in the chat here. Okay, no problem. Okay, so I now want to talk a little bit about what comprises the oral Torah. Okay, I mentioned before that we have the written Torah and there's the oral Torah. Let's talk a little bit about what is in the oral Torah. First is this genre called Midrash Halacha. Right? Midrash might be a term that you're familiar with. Halacha means law. Midrash Halacha is the practice or the genre of deriving law directly from verses in the Torah. Okay, so they're often presented in collections that go by book. Right? There's a book of Midrash Halacha on Exodus, on Leviticus, on Numbers, and on Deuteronomy. Sometimes two on. There isn't one on Genesis because there's very little law going on there. And these collections, there's a few different. We'll talk about this also. Sort of as we get into the class in a few weeks, probably. There are different schools of interpretation here when it comes to Midrash Halacha, different sort of methods of interpreting the Torah. Some of those methods prefer to read really tightly in the text, really straightforward. Sometimes it feels like we're drawing conclusions that are far, far away from what the text seems to be saying. And those are just two different schools of thought, often attributed to Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, respectively. Those two schools of thought. We'll talk about that as we go along. So this is one example. Also happens to be, more or less timely of how Midrash Halacha works. Okay, so there's a verse in Leviticus. It's talking about the holiday of Sukkot, which just ended last week. On the first day, you shall take for yourselves the product of hadar trees, branches of palm trees, boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before your God Hashem 7 days. Okay, that's the verse. The interpretation is in particular on the words for yourselves. And it says, for yourselves belonging to you, and not what is borrowed or stolen, from which it was ruled, one does not fulfill their obligation on the first day of the festival with their neighbor's lulav. Okay, so the derivation here is because it uses the word for yourselves, when it could have just said, you shall take the product of hadar trees, right? But because it adds those words for yourselves, that must teach something in particular. And what it teaches is for yourselves, meaning owned by you. Okay, so that is to say that on the first day of Sukkot, according to this tradition, one cannot use a borrowed or stolen lulav. It has to be a lulav that you own. Okay, so that's just an example of how a Midrash Halacha might work. Okay, all right. There's a second type of midrash, which is the midrash that many of you might be more familiar with, which is basically stories. Okay, these are sometimes based on verses, sometimes just sort of folklore or interesting stories about rabbis. So there is a Gadic midrash that belongs to both the Tannaitic era and the Amoraic era. Okay, it's a genre that sort of spans a long time and even continues well after the close of the Talmud. So it says here, right, it stretches from the beginning of Rabbinic Judaism until the medieval period. Aggadic midrash, these stories, can be found in many different places in the Talmuds and also in other separate collections and sort of, pieced together here and there. I have here the second line that it's a venue for the rabbis to work out issues where they're not constrained by law. Right? So there's this idea that because they're constrained by this oral Torah tradition from Sinai, that they don't really have such an outlet for more creative impulses. And Aggadic midrash is really the venue where they get to work out for themselves, without having the constraints of a received tradition. Okay, so it allows some different room for creativity. Aggadic midrash sort of takes a back seat and is, it says here, sort of reduced to being a second-class genre in the medieval period. This is because oftentimes Aggadic midrash seems, like fantasy or totally unrealistic, engages with all kinds of concepts that are not sort of not of the day in the medieval period. And so the rabbinic movement is critiqued by all types of other groups in their surrounding areas, including Karaites, Muslims, and Christians. And in part, in response to that critique, it sort of takes a back seat, Aggadic midrash. It has sort of regained some steam in the last 100 or 200 years, but it is sort of sometimes seen, because it's stories and it's not as intellectual, there are times where people treat it sort of as second class. Okay, I saw something in the chat. I just want to check on that. Whoop. Beverly. It's all right. Okay, so the Mishnah. Okay, the Mishnah is the first sort of collection of Jewish law after the 5 books of Moses. That's sort of collected in one place, I should say. The Mishnah is the sort of premier Tannaitic text, right? Which means that it is a collection of traditions that lasts until about the year 220. Okay? That means that within the Mishnah there are texts that are, at some of them probably from the early 3rd century, late 2nd century. And there's a lot of debate about just how old some of these texts in the Mishnah are. Obviously, when you have an oral text, it's hard sometimes to really talk about provenance. But it could be that the traditions passed down were several hundred years old, had been passed down for a long time before they were codified. Okay, they were published. Published is a hard thing to say, but I'll say published in the year 220 by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who's sometimes often just called Rabbi or Rebbe. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, a lot to say about him. He was a sort of major political figure in addition to being a major religious figure. Had very close relationships with government officials in Roman Palestine. The sort of traditional story is that the reason why he codified the Mishnah when he did is because of a combination of increased persecution and also because the corpus of rabbinic texts at that time had grown to be so massive that he needed to create something, right? He needed to compile one place where you would find all of the texts that you needed, let's say, even though there were a lot of external texts, which we'll talk about in a second. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi or Rebbe publishes the Mishnah, and then I'll talk about that in a second. It's very hard sometimes to define or categorize the Mishnah by genre, because there are times when it seems like a law code, right? There are times where it certainly seems to just give a law, but then often it will record several different opinions on an issue that are conflicting with one another and not say which one is right, okay? Which doesn't really sound like a law code, okay? So it is in many places a law code, and there are times where it does make a ruling internally, but oftentimes it doesn't. And you're left with, 2, 3, 4, 5 opinions, and you don't know which way to go. Okay. So law code is not really totally the right way of thinking about it. Some people like to think of it as a rabbinic curriculum, right? This is just everything you need to know in order to start being a rabbi, basically. Okay. Something like that. Some people like to think of it as an anthology. There's one scholar who talks about it as a sort of vision of an ideal. If the rabbis were creating an ideal world, this is what it would look like. But really hard to pin down within one genre. There's really nothing like it. The Mishnah is categorized into 6 orders. Okay? These are the 6 orders. And then within the 6 orders are tractates. Right? You'll see here the orders are seeds, festival, women, damages, kodshim, and taharot. Okay, so that's sorry, I switched languages there. Seeds, festival, women, damages, holies, and purities. There we go. This was a new order when Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi at the beginning of the 3rd century created this. He wasn't basing himself on any previous organizational structure. This is a new organizational structure. And after the Talmud, it's not a structure that was ever repeated again. But this is the way that he broke things down. So agricultural law, let's just say, a law about tithing is all here. Here are, right, Shabbat, Pesach, Yoma is a reference to Yom Kippur. Several things here. Several issues dealing with women. Mostly, let's just say, marriage and divorce, and many other sort of adjacent issues. Damages is tort law, and then holies and purities have to do with the temple. Okay. So these are the 6 orders of the Mishnah. We'll come back and look at this chart again towards the end, but this is the way that the Mishnah is organized. Okay. In addition to the Mishnah, there is a publication, a collection called the Tosefta. So the Tosefta is from the same time period as the Mishnah. It's also from the Tannaitic era, so also 1st century to early 3rd century. And it includes texts that didn't make it into the Mishnah. For whatever reason, the Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, when he published the Mishnah, didn't put these in. Right? It's the sort of extra stuff. It follows the same organizational structure that we just saw in the chart a moment ago, but it's significantly longer. It includes more stories, and it's often hard to, I mentioned it's material that didn't make it into the Mishnah, but how exactly or why exactly it didn't make it into the Mishnah is a big topic. We're going to talk about this in next week's session when we look at the Mishnah and the Tosefta together. But there are times when the Tosefta seems like it's commenting on the Mishnah. There are times where it just seems to be complementary material. Very hard to sort of figure out the relationship between these 2 documents. And there's a whole field of academic study that is basically trying to work out what is the Tosefta. There's a lot of academic material on basically that question. And we'll probably talk about that a little bit more next week when we have a chance to look at parallel Mishnah and Tosefta. Okay. Great. Great. Let's move on there. Okay, the Talmud, right? So I mentioned before that the Mishnah often seems like it doesn't come to a conclusion. It presents several conflicting opinions on a topic without deciding which one is the law. And so you might assume that when people receive this document and seed several different opinions without an answer, one of the things they're going to try and do is decide which one is the answer. Okay? And many other things. And so the Talmud is the easiest way of thinking about it is a sort of commentary or furthering of the Mishnah, right? They're discussions based on the Mishnah. The Talmud itself is often called Gemara. Sometimes it's called Mishnah and Gemara, okay, or Talmud. Talmud and Gemara are basically interchangeable terms. The Talmud as a piece was also passed down orally before being put to first in manuscript form. There are several extant manuscripts of the Talmud, and so it's hard to talk about sort of a correct version of the Talmud because there are several manuscripts that often have different variants. Okay, the Talmud is written in a combination of Hebrew and Babylonian Aramaic. Okay, because that's sort of the lingua franca of Babylonia. I mentioned before that Rav, who lives around the beginning of the 3rd century, he was a student of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who was the person who published the Mishnah, if you remember from before. And Rav took the Mishnah and went to Babylonia, and that kicked off study of the Mishnah and commentary on the Mishnah in Babylonia. Okay, so that's beginning of the 3rd century, right around the 220 is the year that people use. I think based on different calculations, we think that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi died in 218. Okay, so you think around 220 is when Rav would have left. The Talmud includes several different genres, right? You might be noticing a theme here, which is that genre is very hard to categorize a lot of these things that we're talking about, because the Talmud includes legal discussion, it includes stories, it includes mysticism. It's really, I mean, you'll see when we start in the next few weeks. It is a really tremendous document. There's nothing like it. There's a reason why it's been as popular as it is, both in Jewish history at large and also as learning the Talmud has been introduced to the masses over the course of the last century or so. It's a really, really special document, and we'll talk a lot more about it as we move forward. This is what the Talmud looks like. This is what the printed Talmud looks like. Ever since the Talmud was printed for the first time, it's looked more or less the same. In the last several decades, a lot of things have been added into the margins, right? So this is a much older printing, this photo here. But it does have consistent layout and more importantly, consistent pagination, which is why you can say, we're going to learn Bava Metzia, page 33a. Right? That's because there's consistent pagination. Okay. These are the different constituent parts of a Talmud page. We're not going to be, I'll talk a little bit about what our specific learning, what the text we're going to use. I'll talk a little bit about the text we will use later on. We're not going to be using this layout, but just so you know, the text of the Talmud itself is here in the middle. Okay, so this is the Mishnah. This is the first page of the Talmud here. This is the Mishnah. This is the Talmud, the Gemara. Okay, always on the inside margin is Rashi. We'll talk a little bit more about Rashi later on, but Rashi is always on the inner margin. And then there's Tosafot, who's on the outer margin. Okay, we'll talk about Rashi and Tosafot in a little while. And there's several other, this is a much more recent printing, this photo, because it has all these special goodies in the margins here. Okay, so if you look right here, the margin is there's a lot more blank space here in this older printing, but in recent times, people have added all sorts of new, fun gadgets. Okay, so in addition to the Babylonian Talmud, there's also the Jerusalem Talmud. It's also sometimes called the Palestinian Talmud, which is a product of, as you might guess, the land of Israel. Okay, so I mentioned that the Mishnah moves to Babylonia around the year 220. And while there were conversations going on in Babylonia, there were also conversations and discussions happening in the land of Israel. The Jerusalem Talmud, we're not really going to look at any of the Jerusalem Talmud here. It's a much more difficult text to read and to learn, in part because there's a lot of reasons, but it wasn't studied as often as the Babylonian Talmud. It's not nearly as well edited as the Babylonian Talmud. And the Babylonian Talmud is really what becomes the uniting document of Rabbinic Judaism in the Middle Ages. The Jerusalem Talmud is studied, but it doesn't have the same reading history. There's not the same attention paid to it. And so because there's not the same attention paid to it, there aren't as many commentaries. And so it's just harder to read, harder to understand, in part because of the piece of it's not being as well edited, and in part because we just have fewer people tried to explain it in the Middle Ages as tried to explain the Babylonian Talmud. There are some other differences between the two. The language is different, right? Babylonian Aramaic and Galilean Aramaic were obviously very similar, but had some grammatical and other differences. And also the cultural backdrop was different, right? In Roman Palestine, you have sort of Christianity emerges as the main other religion, whereas in Babylonia you have Christianity and also pagan worship in Roman Palestine, and then in Babylonia, in the Sasanian Empire, you have Zoroastrianism, right? So those different sort of cultural contexts create different settings and often create different law, different ways of reading. So there's a lot of differences. The other thing is, and part of the reason why the Palestinian Talmud is not as well edited is because it sort of ended suddenly. We don't know exactly what happened, if there was a natural disaster, if there was some persecution. But the Palestinian Talmud, the Yerushalmi, ends in the late 4th century. Some people say 360, some people say 380, and it ends quite suddenly, and so it doesn't have that same editing layer as the Babylonian Talmud does. Okay, there are times where I might refer to the Jerusalem Talmud here and there, but not so often. Okay, we'll just do, I think. Yeah. Okay. So, what happens to the Talmud? I'll I think just do 2 more slides, and then we'll take our break. So, what happens to the Talmud after it is spread? As I mentioned this moment ago, the Babylonian Talmud really becomes the unifying document of Rabbinic Judaism. That happens in part because of a really strong academic culture in Babylonia. And this era of the Geonim, right? This era between 700 and 1038. This has opened up part of how this movement is allowed to grow is the spread of Islam in the Middle East allows trade routes and there's more travel happening throughout the Middle East and also in Africa. And so the literature of Rabbinic Judaism is allowed to spread quickly and pretty far. Then you have the era of called the Rishonim in the medieval period. Right now, at first there were these centers of the land of Israel and Babylonia. Later on, we now have, as I mentioned a second ago, you have North Africa, you have Spain and Portugal. There are Jews in Provence and Germany and in Italy. This is a major era of commentary on the Talmud. And then there's a later era that is hard. I mentioned it starts around the year 1500, and it's sort of unclear when it's going to end, or when it did. Some people like to say that it did end, and now we're in some new era. But I'll say this for all of these. I've said that the eras sometimes are pretty discrete. But it's not like anyone woke up one day and said, "Oh, now I am a Rishon and not a," or well, that's that one actually I think is harder. Now I'm an Acharon and not a Rishon, right? That didn't happen. This is post facto. So it's always hard to know when a new era begins. Okay, one other thing I'll just mention Rashi and the Tosfot. Rashi, one of the most important figures in Jewish history, medieval rabbi in Provence here from 1040 to 1105. Rashi writes a commentary on the Talmud, which is informed in large part by his studies in Germany and France. And Rashi's commentary is a running commentary, which is just supposed to, it does a lot of things, but one of the main things that Rashi does is try and just give you, what is this line saying? How should you understand this line? How should you understand how it relates to what came before? Sometimes he helps you sort of by foreshadowing what's about to come. Sometimes he makes legal rulings within his commentary, and many of his comments are utterly useless to us because he's just translating Aramaic words into Old French. If you happen to know Old French, would gladly appreciate that expertise. There's also another commentary I mentioned here. Let me go back to this picture. So this is Rashi always on the inner margin. On the outer margin is the Tosfot. Tosfot is an era, really a school of interpretation that begins with Rashi's grandsons. And in addition to sometimes doing running commentary, they will often disagree with their grandfather and provide an alternative explanation. Sometimes they will sort of act as try to harmonize different sections of the Talmud. They'll notice that there is a conflict between what's in one section and what's in another section, and they'll try and harmonize those things. Sometimes they will report local customs, and oftentimes they seem to function as, the Talmud ended at such a place. If the Talmud had continued the discussion, this is what that continuation might look like. Right? So they engage in all kinds of different discourses. We're not really going to look at the Tosfot's often very complex. And so there are times I might reference here or there, but we're not gonna learn it so inside. The other thing I'll say about Rashi, this has come up a lot over the course of our class in the last several months. Often Rashi is the main way of understanding a text because he's the one who wrote the commentary. But Rashi can sometimes, in his way, be kind of limiting, because Rashi will tell you that this line means this thing, but sometimes we should keep an open mind and try to figure out if that line could mean something else. Okay. Obviously, Rashi was very smart. Rashi knew a lot. We shouldn't just disregard what he says for no reason, but he can be limiting in that way. Okay. Let's take our break now. When we come back, we'll start to look at, I'll take any questions. If you have any questions that have come up in the last little bit, feel free to write them down, and we can maybe start with that. And then when we come back from our break, we'll really get into what the topic is that we're going to be learning in the next half hour or so, and then also beginning next week. Okay. So I have 21 after. We'll take a 5-minute break. We'll be back at 26 after. See you then. All right, let's start to come back. Okay. So let me saw the couple of things in the chat from before. So the first thing is that let me do this first. Yeah, so these slides will certainly be available. They're already, I forgot to do it before, but I just put it in now. So here's a link to the slides. We also have this folder. So I'll share this in my next email so that the people who just joined have access to it. This is the folder where I put all of our material for everything. You can see this is the orientation we did back in January. This is tonight's. And then there's these two folders. This folder includes articles that I think are interesting and that sort of supplement our conversation. Some of them are about the specific text that we looked at in the last chapter, and some of them are just topics that came up over the course of looking at that chapter that where I knew there was an article and thought it'd be relevant to share. So you can certainly take a look in here, even if you don't have the context of why it was shared. Some really interesting pieces in this folder. This class notes folder, this is the previous chapter starting when I started back in December. Okay, so these are all of the documents. Here I'll just show one just as an example. All right, so this is we started with a new Mishnah. Here's the Talmud down here. This is what our documents generally look like. If you're curious and you want to see some of the material we looked at in the last chapter, you're welcome to go through it. But I'll also start a new folder beginning with the material we'll start next week. Okay, these are all those documents, and so the slides that we've been looking at tonight will stay in that folder, and folks can feel free to reference them and to write me with any questions that come up, anything like that. The other question was about purchasing a Talmud, right? So that's right. As you can see, it's quite expensive. In terms of, I would certainly recommend. I'll talk a little bit towards the end about the version of the Talmud that we are, or actually, I think I'll talk about the version that we're going to be using. There's also, if you want a version of the Talmud that has our specific chapter, there's this book here, which is the Steinsaltz edition of the Talmud. I'll type in the chat exactly what it is. So the version of the Talmud on Sefaria is the Steinsaltz translation. I'll talk about Steinsaltz in just a second. But this was published. This is a little bit different than the version that's on Sefaria. In part, I don't know how well you'll be able to see, but in part because it has a lot of important notes on the side and on the bottom that aren't on Sefaria. Okay, so if you're looking for a version of the Talmud to purchase for our material, I would suggest this. I can find a good link for it, and not exactly sure how. It's one single volume that includes our chapter as well as the chapter we did before, and I think one other chapter maybe, the one that comes after. And I imagine that this single volume would not run. Yeah, like I imagine you could get a copy for maybe $20 or $30, something like that. But I can look into it. But in terms of the Talmud as a whole, if there are great copies you can buy, and also it's available for free on Sefaria. Okay, so what are we gonna be learning? So we just finished the second chapter of Bava Metzia. There are 3 tractates of the Talmud: Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra. Bava in Aramaic means gate, and so Kama, Metzia, and Batra are first, middle, and last. Okay, so the first gate, the middle gate, and the last gate. There was once a time when those three tractates were all one. Here, I'll look here. These three tractates, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, were all one, but it was such an enormous tractate that it was split up into three, and they just named it first, second, and last gate, or first, middle, and last gate. Okay. But generally speaking, it deals with damages. Our chapter, in particular, deals with guardianship and with responsibility for loss and theft when you're guarding or holding onto an object for someone. Okay, that's the main topic. It gets into several other issues, but that's the main topic. We'll begin looking at it in a little bit, and it deals the beginning. It's called Perek Hamafkid, which means the chapter of the one who deposits. Okay, because that's the opening line of the chapter is one who deposits. Okay. Right. This is the same chart as before. Just you'll see here, we're here in Bava Metzia. Okay. Okay. Great. This gets a little bit to what we were talking about before, which is what text we use. The translations of Mishnah that I use are from Josh Kolp, which is if you're on Sefaria, maybe here, let me do this. If you're on Sefaria and you go, so this might be helpful for folks. This is the main page on Sefaria. Okay, it has Tanakh, right, which is the Torah, prophets, and writings. And then here are all these different genres. Right, we talked about the Tosefta, we talked about Midrash. If you go here to the Mishnah, it has it ordered by Seder. Okay, and you scroll down to damages, and you click on Bava Metzia. You click on chapter 3. I think it's my default, but it might also be the default is Josh Kolp's translation. In addition to his translation, there's also this, it's called English Explanation of Mishnah, and it's a further commentary by Josh Kolp that sort of expands on the translation. Okay, so it's a helpful thing to know about. Also, in this main page, you have Talmud here, right? This is where you can access for free an English translation of the entire Talmud. And similarly, if you scroll down to damages, Bava Metzia, right? Hamafkid, chapter 3, and there we are. Okay, that's how that's sort of how to access our text. But as I was mentioning before, the translations of Mishnah generally will come from that Josh Kolp translation. This is what the Sefaria translation looks like. All right. The bolded words here, this may be obvious to some of you may have done this before and you may know, others not. The bold is literally the text as it is in the original, okay, in the Hebrew and or Aramaic. All of the non-bold are the words that are filled in order to basically make the text easier to read. Okay, this translation was done by Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who was a contemporary rabbi. He passed away, I think, a few months into the pandemic in 2020, so he's very, very contemporary. And he did a translation into modern Hebrew of the entire Talmud, and then several people embarked on a project of translating that modern Hebrew into English. Okay, and so that translation into English is what we have here. Steinsaltz was the one who pioneered this sort of distinction of bold and unbold in order to help make the text more readable. So generally speaking, when we look at the Talmud, we're going to be looking at Steinsaltz's translation. There are times where I'll make some edits to the translation, both because sometimes he gives away a lot too early, and he sort of sometimes ruins the fun. And so in order to make sure that our fun is preserved, I'll sometimes remove some of the non-bolded. I'll never remove the bold, but there are times where I will remove the non-bold. Oftentimes, the non-bold in the Steinsaltz is a paraphrase of Rashi. Okay, very often, Steinsaltz will just basically translate Rashi into modern Hebrew or into English, and then insert that into the text. Okay, that sort of gives you an idea of how foundational Rashi's commentary is to how we read the Talmud, for better or for worse. Right, for better because he often helps you understand a difficult line. And the con is that sometimes it can limit, as I was mentioning a little bit earlier, it can limit how we read a text. What I do, let me pull this back up, is I like to separate the Talmud into these stages, right? 1A, 1B, 1C, etc., just to sort of help break down the different technical and argumentative steps. Okay, Steinsaltz does the same thing. Sometimes mine will follow his, sometimes it'll be a little bit different. But this is what the text more or less will look like. Okay. Let me check the chat. If any questions, folks can feel free to raise their real or virtual hand. Yeah, Gabrielle.
I am wondering, I mean, we have the first, what we're studying now, I mean, Rabbinic Judaism as a whole is studying from printed books. And before that, I suppose there were codices. I mean, books like our books, but written by hand.
Yeah.
And before that, we were scrolls. And I'm just trying to figure how people studied the Talmud with scrolls, because I don't suppose that you had the Mishnah, the Gemara, and Rashi and Tosafot already there. So each one of our books would be a shelf full of scrolls.
Yeah.
And I can't even imagine how could there be more than one copy. I mean, how that also was transmitted around, not just the tshuva, the responsa, but how people in other parts of the world were able to study Talmud before there were books. I just can't envision it.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and the answer is not simple. I'm gonna post an article in the folder that I think might help begin to answer some of your questions. One of the most important scholars of the Talmud in the 20th century is someone named Saul Lieberman, and he wrote an article. He wrote a book called Hellenism in Greek Palestine. Is that right? I think it's Hellenism in Greek Palestine. Should know that title. But anyway, there's a chapter that's called The Publication of the Mishnah. And in that chapter, he deals with a lot of the questions you're asking about in terms of learning from a scroll, learning orally. I think part of the answer to your question is that the amount of oral repetition and memorization is larger than we could possibly understand. Like what some people had in their minds is to us unfathomable. There are still some communities today where people have memorized an inordinate amount of material. But that being said, a lot of what you're asking is, when the text, when the corpus became so large, like that's part of the reason why specific texts were created, is to try and bring together all these sort of disparate strands that can, as you said, just get totally overwhelming. So I don't know, it's a really good question. I think that the short answer is that people did study from text, but I think that the main thing is that the oral study of rabbinic texts is much, much greater than we can ever imagine. Right? The way that the text was repeated and passed down orally, truly, really, really unfathomable. Okay, great. Thank you, Avi. Greek and Jewish Palestine, or Hellenism and Jewish Palestine. Great. Okay. All right. So I want to start talking about our chapter a little bit. This is a chart that we looked at, or a version of a chart that we looked at actually several months ago in our previous chapter. As I mentioned, the text that we're going to be dealing with has to do with guardianship and responsibility for objects, right? What type of a guardian are you? So someone who takes care of an object, and what responsibility do you have if something goes wrong? Okay. So you'll see here this chart, which is how, according to the rabbis, this is how these categories break down. Okay. A borrower, someone who borrows and gets to use an object without having to pay anything for it, is liable across the board. Always going to be liable. If something goes wrong, always going to be liable. Okay. There's a paid guardian, or maybe a renter is the better way of saying it, who would be liable for loss or theft. If something happened that was out of their control, they would be able to take an oath and be exempt from payment. Okay. And then negligence, always, if there's negligence, you're liable. Okay. And the content of the oath, by the way, that would exempt a person, the oath would be, I did not do anything negligent. Okay. That would be the content of the oath. Then there's the unpaid guardian, which is what we're going to start to talk about, who can be exempted with an oath in cases of loss or theft or something out of one's control. Something like, the animal drops dead, or, there's some natural event that happens, things like that. And then obviously for negligence is going to be liable. Okay. Any questions about these categories? Well, this is going to be sort of foundational for our next few weeks. So it's important to start thinking about them. Jude, please.
Self-determining whether you did something negligent or not.
Yeah, so it's a good question. Some of it has to do with, did you, if you're guarding something that's in a pen, did you lock the pen or did you leave it open? Right, something like that. So sometimes it can be a little bit more objective of a question, but you're right that it is sort of something that you get to, perhaps determine yourself, unless there are witnesses to your negligence.
So it could be a source of debate sometimes if it wasn't clear cut.
Could be, yeah, could be. The other thing that I'll say that to notice is that the way this works generally is the greater the benefit, the greater the liability. Right. So the borrower, for instance, gets benefit in that they get to use the object and they don't have to pay anything. But that comes with great responsibility in that they are always going to be liable if something goes wrong. Okay, so that sort of benefit and liability question is an important way of thinking about what's going on here. Okay. Two verses here that come basically next to each other in the book of Exodus that'll be helpful to in terms of reading our next Mishnah. Okay. If someone steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, 5 oxen shall be paid for the ox and 4 for the sheep. Okay, so if the animal is no longer there, the payment is 4 or 5 times. Okay, a few verses later, if what was stolen, regardless of what the animal is found alive, the thief pays double. Okay, so we have double for found alive, paid by the thief. And then, depending on the animal, 4 for sheep and 5 for ox, you pay 4 or 5 times if, for instance, you slaughtered the animal and sold the meat, let's say, something like that. Okay? Okay. So all just sort of background material to get us where we need to be. All right, this is the first Mishnah of our chapter. Okay, this is where things begin. One activity that I like to do, I think it's gone really well in terms of our learning in the last few months. It's what I like to call juicing the Mishnah, okay, which means that we'll read the Mishnah and then we'll try and juice it as much as possible, right? Ask questions, what seems odd, what needs further explanation, what questions do you have, what does or doesn't make sense. And I do this for a couple of different reasons. One is it's just good before we start reading the Talmud, it's good to sort of generate our own thoughts and questions on the Mishnah. And then also there are, I would say, probably every time we've done this, someone has raised something that is then raised in the Talmud. Okay. One of the best feelings in the world is when you raise a question and then it gets raised by someone who lived 1,500 years ago. Just feels like tremendous. Okay. It's also important to notice when you're wondering something that doesn't get asked by the Talmud, okay, which is not a reflection of you and your questions. It's just a reflection of we think about different things, we ask different questions, we have different priorities, all of those different things. But it's important to note both when is there alignment between the things that we're wondering and when is there not alignment. Okay. Okay. So we're going to read the Mishnah in a second, and then I want to get some questions and comments. Okay. Could I have a volunteer to read the Mishnah? I don't think there's any difficult language in this one. Yeah, Anna, please.
Okay, if one left an animal or utensils in their fellow's keeping, and they were stolen or lost, and the fellow made restitution and did not want to take an oath, for they have taught an unpaid guardian may take an oath and be exempt from liability. If the thief is found, he must make twofold restitution, and if he slaughtered or sold the sheep or ox, he must make 4 of 5-fold restitution. To whom does he pay? The one with whom the money was deposited. If one's fellow, the unpaid guardian, takes an oath and does not want to take restitution, if the thief is found, he must take twofold restitution. And if he slaughtered or sold the sheep or ox, he must make 4 of 5-fold restitution. To whom does he pay? To the owner of the property deposited.
Okay. Hopefully our background material is helpful in terms of some of what's going on here in terms of double payment, 4 and 5, different types of guardians, all of that. Okay. All right. Wait, first I saw there was something in the chat here. Great. Yeah, we can do this here. Oops. Okay. Put that here. How are restitution claims decided? Okay, that's a question that we'll put in here. Anybody else have Let's do that. A question or a comment on the Mishnah. Something you're wondering, something that needs explanation. Give you a second to... Also, if there are any clarification questions on language, you can do that. Yep, Andrea.
So after the first paragraph, it says, to whom does he pay? The one with whom the money was deposited. Well, I don't even understand what that says, because there was no deposit originally made. Something was left with some in the fellow's keeping, and he decides he wants to make restitution. So I don't understand what that line is saying. I
think this is the culp. I'm gonna do. You're right. Oops. I'm gonna do that. Does that help?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's yeah. Another thing that I'll just mention here. This is going to be used a lot in the translation. Is the term Bailey, okay, which refers to the one with whom the object was deposited. Okay, it's not really a word that we use so often. Maybe people are lawyers here. Maybe that you do, but that's a term in order to not have to say the one with whom the item was deposited. Okay, but it's okay. Great, thank you for that clarification, Beverly. Beverly, you're still muted.
Hope you can hear me okay. Wondered about why they're comparing animals or utensils. What?
Great. I'll give it away. That is the first question the Gemara asks. Okay, that one right there. All right, so 10 points to Beverly. Okay, great question, Suzanne. Suzanne, was your...
Yeah, it
Yeah.
always takes me a minute to unmute. So really quickly, let's say that I ask my sister to take care of my ox. I'm going to bring my ox over because I'm going with my husband on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And she, therefore, is watching my ox, and the ox gets stolen. And the ox gets eaten, so therefore restitution needs to be made. Who would wind up getting it? Her or me? Technically, it's my ox. She's just doing me a favor by watching it.
And sorry, maybe I missed you say it or not say it.
Okay. So I have an ox.
Yeah.
I asked my sister to watch it. I bring it over to her farm because I'm going with my husband on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. For whatever reason, she and her family can't go with us, so I ask her to watch my ox. The ox gets stolen, the ox gets eaten, restitution needs to get made. Who would get the restitution? Her or me? Because technically it's my ox.
So it depends on if she pays. If she pays you first. So it's a good question. It depends in part on if she pays you, she pays you first. If she pays you before the thief is caught, then she would get the money from the thief. Okay? Because by paying you, she basically takes ownership of the animal.
Gotcha.
Okay? If she doesn't pay, then it goes to you.
Okay.
It's a great question. And when we look at the Mishnah Tosefta parallel, which is one of the first things we'll do next week, I think that there'll be some sort of richer material for it's a good question.
Okay.
The question of does she pay first? Does she all of those things? Yeah. I just saw in the chat, Shira and Andy asked, what's an unpaid guardian? So I think it's someone you deposit. It's the case that Suzanne just mentioned, right? Someone you're going on a trip and you just want someone to watch your ox. They're not, I think the difference between borrower and unpaid guardian here, I think, is the unpaid guardian isn't using it. right? The borrower, someone borrows, you know, a lawnmower, let's say, in order to use it, right? The ox, they're not going to use. They're not getting any benefit. Okay. And they have greater, they've got to look out for it. Yeah. Jacinda. Jacinda, was your hand up before?
It's not unmuting. I'm sorry. It just wasn't. I thought it was unmuted and it didn't.
That's all right.
I was wondering because usually it's much more spelled out very specifically in terms of what this means. It says that the fellow made restitution or whatever and doesn't want to take an oath. They taught that an unpaid guardian may take an oath and be exempt from liability, but they don't say what the oath is or to whom the oath is made, or you know, they usually talk about witnesses, like what oath would this person be taking in order to not have to make restitution, and why would one not take an oath like to make restitution unless I don't know, unless they it just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, especially if they weren't liable for the loss or thefts of the ox or sheep, unless the oath was some sort of complicated process.
Right. Great. Okay. So first is what's the content of the oath, and then second is why would anyone in this situation decide not to do it? Yeah. Great. Samantha.
I'm really interested in the reasons for the specific numbers. You know, like why the 4 and the 5, for instance. What makes those so significant?
It's a good question. I'll try and do. I had the same thought. It's in part a little bit more of a sort of biblical question than a Talmud question, which is for sure fair game here. I'll try and do some research onto what that in terms of what that might be about. It's a good question. Good. Any so we're coming up on the end here. Okay, great. Any further? I'll just say the first thing we're going to do next week when we really start this chapter in earnest is look at this Mishnah again. Okay, so if you have thoughts or questions that are sort of percolating right now, I would write them down and come with them next week. Jude, yeah, last thought.
Oh, yeah, and it's not so much a question, it's just I was thinking on what Beverly brought up, that why compare the animals and the utensils. It's easier to make to use the utensil, because you mentioned something about that. So that could be why, and not the animal. You wouldn't be using.
Good. Right. The other important thing there is that, right, this is where it's sort of interesting to compare the Mishnah with the material from the Torah, because the Torah there didn't mention vessels, didn't mention utensils. It just mentioned the animals. And all of a sudden, we've inserted utensils in there. Okay, so that's something to notice. I think for sure something to notice. Okay, great. I hope. Thank you everyone for joining in this. It's already in the useful. Great, amazing. I had a feeling that might be the case. Great. So if you go to that useful materials folder, you'll already find that Lieberman article. Amazing. Great. Thank you so much to everyone for joining, for engaging and asking questions. This is not exactly what a typical session looks like. The last few minutes, that's more what it looks like. But there'll be more of that next week. So yeah, hopefully I'll see you next week, 7:30. We'll really begin this third chapter journey together. So thank you everyone for coming, and I'll see you soon. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Okay.